If there is one thing that Monster Hunter excels at, it is creature design. From small critters to world-ending behemoths, each and every member of the series' monster cast is created with care and consideration for their quality as not just video game enemies, but as imagined pieces of a truly living world. So, naturally, Capcom started celebrating the series by inviting a handful of scientists to their offices and asking them to speculate about the anatomy, ecology, and evolution of various Monster Hunter monsters. These meetings and interviews were then collected into 3 books called Super Biology Reports, 2 of them for the 10th anniversary in 2014 and 1 for the 15th anniversary in 2019. I already covered the first book in a previous video, so make sure to check that one out if you haven't seen it and are interested. But today, let's discuss the second book. While the first volume only included the inputs of 3 expert guests, this second volume consists of reviews and interviews from 7 professionals, ranging from bird researchers to university professors to expert wildlife photographers. While I'm here, I want to quickly apologize for misreading 2 of the names from the last video that return in this volume. It's Yoshitsugu Kobayashi, not Kaiji Kobayashi, and Yumin Mori, not Yutami Mori. Apologies for this error on my part, and big thanks to Out of Place Zoologist for giving me a list of correct readings for all the names in this and the next book. Thank you so much. Before we get started, keep in mind that these experts are explicitly speculating and have limited knowledge of the games and their lore. What you hear in this video is not to be taken as hard canon, but rather as interesting ideas and ruminations from professional sources. If you want to incorporate it into your headcanons, I can't and wouldn't want to stop you. Alright, enough foreplay, let's tango. The book opens with Kazuto Kawakami from the Forestry Institute of Hachioji taking a look at Seregios. He notes that while the Seregios seems like a fierce monster, its body actually implies a history of vulnerability. Apex predators like tigers generally display adaptations geared towards hunting and fighting, and often have no specialized defensive features. The Seregios' blade scale coat, however, seems to be primarily defensive in nature, as it would prevent any attacker from biting it effectively. If the Seregios truly was an apex, it would have a body that was more offense-oriented. Kawakami thus wonders if there may have existed a creature that regularly preyed on Seregios until somewhat recently. He then pushes his idea further and wonders if perhaps the Seregios' evolution was defined by being a prey animal for much of its past, rather than being a predator. Kawakami notes that the blade scale's ability to detach easily is reminiscent of how pigeon feathers detach when a predator grabs them, or how some lizards can drop their tails to distract hungry attackers. Perhaps the Seregios' scales work or used to work the same way, detaching when grabbed by an enemy to allow the Seregios to escape with its life. Kawakami thus proposes that the Seregios' blade scales originally developed for this defensive purpose, becoming easily detachable to prevent being grabbed by a predator, with the ability to launch them as projectiles emerging as a later, secondary application. He then moves on to discuss the Seregios' mobility. Most animals have bodies that are designed to reduce air resistance when moving forward, with many structures such as scales and fins tapering forwards for that purpose. But the Seregios' scales are tapered backwards, which implies an increased backwards mobility. Being able to move backwards skillfully is exceptionally rare in nature, with only the hummingbird being able to fly backwards among the birds. Kawakami also comments on the shape of the Seregios' feet here. They are X-shaped, with 2 toes in the front and 2 in the back. This would be a terrible structure for walking forwards, but when considering the rest of the Seregios' body, its function becomes clear. Each toe can hook into the ground and help the wyvern push into the air from a slightly different angle, meaning the Seregios can take off rapidly in essentially any direction. Kawakami thus concludes that the Seregios' backwards tapered scales and X feet allow it to rapidly change directions and fly with a mobility unseen in other species. This would make it extremely effective at hit-and-run strategies, as it could attack from and flee towards any direction. To put it in Kawakami's own words, the Seregios can float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and flee like a shrimp. Returning from the last video, Professor Yoshitsugu Kobayashi from the Hokkaido University Museum tackles the mighty Diablos and wonders about its habitat. The desert is an extremely harsh environment to live in, but it isn't all equally hellish. Creatures living on the borders of the desert have a very different life than those that live more towards the center. Kobayashi proposes that since the Diablos has strong wing arms with which it could travel on air or underground, it can likely pick and choose which regions of the desert to inhabit, giving it an advantage less mobile animals don't have. He also points out the Diablos' heavy shell, which covers the wyvern from head to toe. According to Kobayashi, this structure is reminiscent of the armor found on Ankylosaurus, and might play a crucial role in retaining water and regulating temperature. Kobayashi then moves his attention to the Diablos' head. The frill at the back of the head seems to protect the neck from attacks, and the large horns seem like an obvious tool for combat. Due to their size, Kobayashi asserts that these horns probably also have decorative functions, intimidating enemies and attracting mates. Overall, the structure reminds him of Triceratops, even if the Diablos is missing one horn by comparison. Kobayashi then concludes this section by proposing an alternative function of the horns. The Diablos is known for its loud roars. This is insofar curious in that reptiles and birds do not possess vocal cords and must produce sounds in other ways. This was likely also true for dinosaurs, and while no one can know if they made sounds and what they might have been like, one dinosaur has opened up a fascinating possibility. Parasaurolophus was a hadrosaur with a large, long crest on its head. This structure has been found to have been hollow, and some experts have proposed that this dinosaur could funnel air through this hollow space to create loud sounds like some kind of instrument. Kobayashi proposes that the Diablos' horns may work similarly, having hollow spaces that resonate with exhaled air to amplify the wyvern's roars and make them as powerful as they are in-game. This doesn't quite work with what we see in-game when we break Diablos' horns, but the idea that the Diablos roars using its horns as a massive trombone is really funny to me, so I don't know, you go, Professor. Next, Yumin Mori from Chiba University takes a look at Nargacuga. Looking at its feathery body pouncing on prey from above, Mori is reminded of owls, and notes that the Nargacuga displays many similarities to birds of prey. He speculates that the Nargacuga originally began developing various mammalian features, such as its very cat-like ears, before life in tall tree forests pushed it to convergently develop some bird-like features. That is why, for example, it might have developed a beak lined with teeth. Mori also dedicates some time to the Nargacuga's eyes. Lore-wise, the eyes are said to turn red as the skin around them flushes with blood, but Mori is unconvinced by this explanation. After all, the eyes clearly glow, which blood by itself could not do. Instead, he draws a parallel to how many carnivore eyes shine in the dark. This is made possible by a structure called the tapetum lucidum, a layer of tissue that sits right behind the retina of the eyes of many carnivores. When light hits the eyeball, this specialized structure reflects visible light back through the retina, giving the photoreceptors on the retina more light to perceive and analyze. This is how night vision in animals works, and why the eyes of a cat glow in dim conditions. Mori proposes that if the Nargacuga's red eyes are indeed a result of a tapetum lucidum, then it might actually even have infrared vision. This tissue reflects visible light, and if the eyes are constantly shining in an intense red, then the vision must prioritize the red zone of the light spectrum. So perhaps this rage state also allows the Nargacuga to see infrared, and, by extension, track prey through body heat. Moving on, wildlife photographer Toshimitsu Matsuhashi takes on the King Dong himself, Khezu. Like most of us when we first met it, Matsuhashi questions what he's even looking at. Khezu, as he notes, has a mouth reminiscent of a lamprey, but its skin and face when the mouth is closed remind him of some species of catfish. Its neck expands like a worm, its tail looks like a leech, its legs are gecko-like, and its wings those of bats. In addition, it seems to produce bioelectricity, like an eel. Matsuhashi concludes that the Khezu is a creature that defies classification purely by physical features. He then decides to, like Mori before him, push back on some of the established lore of the series. White Khezu are implied to be albino individuals, while the red Khezu is what the species is actually supposed to look like. Matsuhashi takes issue with the use of the term albino here. Albinism makes the affected tissue transparent, and since the body is filled with blood vessels, an albino Khezu would, curiously, be red or pink rather than white. Instead, Matsuhashi proposes that the Khezu's white skin is probably a result of troglomorphic amelanism, a phenomenon where the ability to produce body pigmentation degenerates as the body adapts to life in dark caves, where body color is virtually useless. Lastly, Matsuhashi also investigates the idea that Khezu sees primarily through smell. While it's certainly a factor, Matsuhashi asserts that the wyvern would not be able to react as quickly to stimuli as it does in-game if it only relied on smell, which is an extremely slow and imprecise sense even when specialized. Instead, he proposes that the Khezu might use sound and vibrations to sense more immediate changes in its environment, and even wonders if it might use some kind of ultrasonic echolocation. It might even use its infamous roars to map out its surroundings. Matsuhashi concludes by briefly commenting on Khezu's reproduction, where eggs are laid directly into the still-living, paralyzed body of prey. He notes that this strategy probably exists to ensure that the young have food immediately upon hatching, even in the harsh lands that the Khezu inhabit. Kobayashi handles the next section on Brachydios, and begins by noting its enormous head crest. He compares it to how many dinosaurs, such as Triceratops and Pachycephalosaurus, had head ornaments that functioned both as weapons, but also were crucial for mate selection. Kobayashi wonders if the Brachydios' bizarre head shape might be a result of sophisticated mating conditions emerging over time. Kobayashi also identifies the external fang-like protrusions on the lower jaw as another probable result of a sexual arms race, like how the fangs of a saber-toothed cat were likely important in attracting mates. He concludes that sexual competition must truly be fierce among Brachydios. He further identifies a possible cause of this ferocity in the slime mold, the monster is known for. While in-game, its role in the Brachydios' life is clearly symbiotic, Kobayashi asserts that this mold would likely begin its relationship with the wyvern as a parasite. He compares it to the parasitic wounds found on Su, one of the best preserved T-Rex specimens in history. Like it probably happened with her, young Brachydios that are first infected with the slime mold likely do not benefit from its presence for a long time, the mold simply siphoning their energy and threatening their lives. While the mold obviously wants to keep its host alive in order to feed off of it for longer, it likely ends up working as a selection factor by accident, killing off any juveniles that aren't strong enough to withstand its parasitic presence. Once a Brachydios reaches maturity, it starts wielding the mold as a weapon, and the relationship turns from parasitic to symbiotic. Kobayashi notes that this would make the mold into another powerful marker of sexual fitness. The more slime mold a Brachydios has, the harsher the conditions that it survived, and the higher its degree of fitness. Kobayashi then loops this back around to the head crest. If the slime mold is a way to attract mates, then these massive cranial structures are a perfect place to show off the quantity and quality of one's mold. With Barroth, Kobayashi questions how such a large creature could survive as a pure insectivore. Insects are an excellent source of protein, but the problem is eating them in large enough numbers to maintain one's body weight. Since the Barroth doesn't seem to have an anteater-like tongue to invade anthills with, Kobayashi proposes that it probably just scoops up and swallows anthills whole, gaining nutrients not just from its inhabitants, but also the plant matter many ants use in constructing their kingdoms. He even wonders if part of the reason why the Barroth evolved to be so large is that its digestive organs had to become longer to properly digest the variety of plant and insect tissue this strategy would yield. Kobayashi then discusses the ways in which Barroth adapts to and benefits from life in the mud. While it is known that the Barroth uses its modified nose to breathe through its head crest like a snorkel when submerged in mud, Kobayashi wonders if it might have a secondary respiration system as well. Many animals that have lungs supplement them with the ability to breathe through their skin, for example. So, he proposes that the Barroth might additionally have a primitive aquatic respiration system that allows it to extract oxygen from the watery mud around it, breathing it in through the skin kind of like a frog. Doing this while slowing down its metabolic rate would allow the Barroth to stay submerged in the mud for very long periods at a time. Kobayashi emphasizes that because the mud presents a fairly difficult environment to traverse for most animals, those creatures that have successfully adapted to it live fairly good lives. Predators rarely venture into the muck, and mud functions as a natural trap for smaller prey. So, by adapting to this niche, the Barroth has secured itself a sustainable way of life. Kobayashi's contributions continue into a brief section on Uragaan, where he investigates its ore-focused diet. He points out that while there were no dinosaurs that just ate ores, many of them are believed to have licked calcium. As they had to lay massive eggs with shells made of calcium, dinosaurs needed to supplement their diet with it whenever they could. The Uragaan may be similar, supplementing its life with minerals necessary for its bodily functions. But Kobayashi remains unconvinced that it can live off of eating rocks just like that. He proposes that what it might actually be eating are colonies of algae and microorganisms that live on rocks, and that the added minerals are simply a bonus. Kobayashi is then asked to roughly estimate the weight of the Uragaan, including all the rock that is attached to its body. Assuming that the density of the rock fused onto the Uragaan is roughly 3 grams per cubic centimeter, he calculates that the protrusions on its back alone would weigh around 60 tons. Considering the size of the body as a whole, Kobayashi estimates that the Uragaan's total body weight would likely surpass 100 tons. Kawakami returns to discuss the Yian Kut-Ku, starting with its shell. He asserts that the bright pink shell is likely intended to attract mates, and compares it to the color of a flamingo. Flamingos famously get their color from their diet, absorbing pigments from algae such as spirulina. Kawakami then wonders if the Kut-Ku's shell functions similarly. He also points out the existence of the blue Yian Kut-Ku, and notes that dietary differences between species living in different environments could explain the coloration differences as well. Next, Kawakami questions the purpose of its massive frill. Being an extension of the ear, it obviously helps with catching sounds, but Kawakami notes that this is a massive and evolutionarily costly adaptation, so it would likely have multiple purposes to justify that cost. When enraged, the Kut-Ku expands the frill to maximum size, so it's possible that it plays a role as a threat display. Kawakami also proposes that the frill's flexibility and size would make it useful as a rudder while flying, manipulating air resistance through different angles and aiding with balance and direction. While the Kut-Ku may seem intimidating to new hunters, Kawakami assures it too has much to fear. Its eyes are located at the sides of its head, a classic feature of prey animals. Predators, by comparison, have their eyes facing forwards. Lateral eyes like this give the animal a wide field of vision, but sacrifice the ability to judge three-dimensional distances accurately due to the lack of binocular vision. This means that the Kut-Ku is excellent at detecting enemies, but struggles to pin down fast-moving targets. This is probably why its preferred prey is earth-dwelling bugs such as Conchu. Kawakami then notes that the Kut-Ku seems to be able to eat the armored Conchu despite having no teeth. Since the Kut-Ku swallows them whole, Kawakami assumes that the Kut-Ku, like many birds, has a gizzard. This is a kind of pre-stomach that processes food not through chemical digestion, but by grinding it down through sheer muscular force. This is, according to Kawakami, probably how the Kut-Ku is able to digest Conchu, with its gizzard breaking their armor before the actual stomach begins dissolving them. Naturally, the next monster on the list for Kawakami is Yian Garuga, and our expert proposes a really interesting subversion of what we might usually associate with this wild beast. Despite its temper, the Garuga's spiky armor and eyes on the side of its head seem to also imply a long history of being primarily a prey animal. Kawakami even identifies the poisonous tail as a sign of this. If you wanted to use poison for attacking or hunting, you'd develop it in the fangs or claws, but poison in the tail implies that the venom is to be used while fleeing from an attacker. Why else would you ever turn your back on an enemy? The tail also helps repelling attackers that assault the Garuga from its blind spot, since its massive ears don't allow it to easily see behind itself. Kawakami develops this idea further by noting that the dark color of the Garuga would not be particularly stealthy. In open areas, dark colorations stand out. Instead, he compares it to the coloration of cormorants, where being more easily visible allows individuals to find each other more easily, in order to form protective flocks. Perhaps Yian Garuga actually used to, or still do, live in massive colonies. Kawakami notes the shape of the foot, with one claw angled backwards, as being adapted to grasping tree branches, so it's possible that enormous Garuga flocks congregate on treetops at night. This could even explain the Garuga's roar. As seen in-game, it doesn't seem to serve an obvious purpose, but Kawakami wonders if once upon a time it would have functioned as a warning shriek to alert an entire Garuga colony of an incoming attacker. Now, the lone wolf Yian Garuga we know from the games doesn't really seem to fit this description, and Kawakami does have a possible explanation. The Garuga and the Kut-Ku are obviously related, so why did the Garuga develop this way while the Kut-Ku didn't? Kawakami believes it might be because the young Garuga evolved in an environment with many extremely aggressive competitors. Facing an uphill battle, the Garuga branch of the family had to constantly one-up its own abilities, developing harder shells, hotter fireballs, growing poisonous barbs, gathering together into flocks for safety, etc. At some point, the young Garuga must have been able to overcome the challenges of its rough environment, and began developing into the lone wolf we know now. Simultaneously, it must have begun expanding its habitat, which is why we only see the lone wolf versions of them in-game. Kawakami concludes that since the Kut-Ku and Garuga are so closely related, and now share habitats for perhaps the first time in eons, it is likely that a hybrid species between the two could emerge. Next, Kawakami investigates the Gypceros' habit of stealing shiny objects. In his opinion, this behavior is probably tied to the Gypceros' need for gastroliths, small stones that some birds swallow to help with breaking down food. In the Gypceros habitat, a shiny surface might be associated with polished rocks and ores, which would make for excellent gastroliths. Kawakami also notes that by using gastroliths, the Gypceros will be able to eat hard nuts and shellfish, which might give it the edge it needs to survive despite not being a particularly powerful monster. Another possible aspect of the Gypceros' diet might be its poison. Animals that produce their own venom, such as many snakes, are usually fairly hesitant to actually use it. Producing poison is expensive in terms of both energy and time. The Gypceros, meanwhile, spits venom quite liberally, which leads Kawakami to believe that it does not produce its own poison. Rather, it might derive it from its diet. Kawakami then turns his attention over to the Gypceros' head crest and its ability to produce light. No known terrestrial vertebrates can produce light on their own, so Kawakami proposes that the light might be created by a colony of symbiotic microorganisms. He singles out Noctiluca scintillans, a marine microorganism that is known to produce light when hit with the force of ocean waves. So, similarly, the crest of the Gypceros might be home to a similar colony that emits a flash when physically struck by the wyvern's beak. Then, Kawakami proposes a possible evolutionary history tied to this light mechanism. While presently it can produce powerful flashes, it's reasonable to assume that this ability was quite weak when it first developed. With lessened intensity, the Gypceros' light would be entirely useless during the day, so Kawakami wonders if its ancestors were originally nocturnal. The light comes in flashes and cannot be sustained, so even at night, it would be impractical as a consistent light source. Rather, Kawakami argues that the light mechanism might have originally evolved as a way for Gypceros to communicate with each other across long distances in the night, flashing their lights rhythmically to send various messages. As the power of the light flash increased over time, the Gypceros repurposed it as a weapon. Kawakami's next target is the Qurupeco and its oddly colorful body. Like many birds of paradise, the Qurupeco is highly decorated and is, in addition, adapted to performing loud and flashy dance performances. This would make it exceptionally easy prey, so Kawakami asserts that these features must have evolved from a fierce history of sexual competition among the males. He also wonders if the Qurupeco we see in-game are all males, and if the females might be dull and quiet by comparison, since they get free choice of their mates and don't have to specialize in performance and flashiness. A creature so flashy might seem like it should have gone extinct long ago, but Kawakami stresses that the Qurupeco has some truly fierce defensive mechanisms. Looking at its wingtips, Kawakami notes that the ability to create fire sparks by clicking them together implies that those tips consist of some sort of metal. He compares this to the scaly foot gastropod, a snail that uses symbiotic bacteria to fuse metals directly onto its shell. Kawakami, thus, wonders if the Qurupeco might also have some kind of bacterial symbiosis that allows it to metallize the tips of its wing arms. But what would truly ensure the Qurupeco's survival is its ability to summon other monsters by imitating their calls. Kawakami identifies this as a vocal application of Batesian mimicry, where animals borrow the strength of other species by seeking or imitating their presence. A famous example of this would be the hoverfly, whose coloration mimics that of wasps. This single adaptation is probably why the Qurupeco can continue to thrive, according to Kawakami. After all, it can just sick a Deviljho on anyone that is bothering it. This section concludes with a tangent on how a Qurupeco might taste. Looking at its feet, Kawakami notes the small webbings between the toes, which imply that it spends some time near or in water, but not enough to be a great swimmer. Its gharial-like mouth is a further sign that it probably mostly eats fish. Kawakami muses that the Qurupeco probably derives the flammable liquid it uses to spit fire with from the fat in the fish that it eats. But more importantly, that fish fat would likely be deposited inside the Qurupeco's tissue and influence its meat quality. Kawakami ponders that the bird-like Qurupeco would probably combine the taste of chicken meat and fish fat into a truly delicious dish, but one that must be eaten fresh, as the fish fat would probably sour the taste if left standing for too long. Fumihito Muto from Tokai University's Faculty of Marine Science returns here after his contributions in the first book to take a look at Zamtrios. He begins by attempting to understand Zamtrios' ability to shroud itself in freezing armor by expelling freezing mist. He proposes a theory wherein the Zamtrios' frost sac consists of two components. A major chamber holds a supercooled liquid, the key ingredient. This liquid is cooled by a countercurrent system that connects to the large dorsal fin, whose surface area funnels cold temperatures into this chamber to maintain the supercooling. Meanwhile, a minor chamber contains colonies of symbiotic bacteria, which process some of the Zamtrios' diet into volatile materials, such as various kinds of alcohols. Through the use of specialized valves, the Zamtrios can forcibly mix these two ingredients within its frost sac, resulting in a violent reaction that produces copious amounts of freezing gas. This gas is then expelled through specialized pores in various areas of the skin, immediately freezing ambient air and forming the Zamtrios' iconic ice armor. Muto concludes this section by theorizing about the way Zamites hatch and develop. According to him, it would make sense for Zamtrios to lay its eggs around narrow ice passages or cave entrances, areas that various animals will traverse at some point. The Zamites don't hatch immediately when they're ready, but instead lay dormant until a potential prey walks by. The vibrations and carbon dioxide produced by the passing animal trigger the hatching process, and the Zamites descend onto the poor thing, hungry for meat. This strategy would ensure immediate nutrition and put them on the path to becoming a full Zamtrios. Muto theorizes that this process would be repeatable, with Zamites going dormant again until the next attack and the next, continuing until they had eaten enough to transform into their adult state. Matsuhashi begins the section on Tetsucabra by broadly comparing it to extant amphibians. While it broadly resembles a frog, Matsuhashi notes that its body is covered in hard scales, and that it has a tail, features that indicate it must have diverged from other amphibians a very long time ago. The hard scales would provide a level of adaptability to temperature and dryness that typical frog skin lacks, which leads Matsuhashi to believe that this toad is specialized for life on land. He does, however, note that the belly of the Tetsucabra seems to have frog-like skin, which would allow it to absorb water through its underside. This may be an additional way for the Tetsucabra to hydrate itself, by simply walking over puddles and wading through shallow water. Matsuhashi then theorizes about the tail. While it may simply exist to help the creature balance, it presents an additional possible function. Since the Tetsucabra is a land-dwelling amphibian, it would likely need to carry its eggs inside of its mouth until they hatch, since amphibian eggs will dry out if not constantly moisturized. During this period, the Tetsucabra would be unable to eat. Matsuhashi thus proposes that the bulbous, soft white tail tip might serve as a fat storage, where Tetsucabra can stock up to survive the hatching period. This storage may also enable it to survive various harsh environments, such as the frozen seaway. Next, Matsuhashi notes how the Tetsucabra combines different beneficial traits from all over the frog family. Its folding hind legs are reminiscent of waterside frogs, which allows it to jump with enormous force. Simultaneously, its movements in battle display a great agility on solid ground, which indicates that the Tetsucabra might possess the strong and flexible joints that are more typically seen in land-dwelling amphibians. Finally, Matsuhashi inspects the jaw. Despite what one might think, bizarre facial features are actually quite common in frogs. Some are explicitly functional, such as the snout of the termite frog, which helps in burrowing. Others are more ornamental, such as the whiskers of the mustache toad, which it only grows during breeding season. In the end, Matsuhashi decides that the Tetsucabra's tusks are likely more functional than they are ornamental, and would probably be used to dig holes. Muto returns to discuss how the body of everyone's favorite Piscine, the Plesioth, relates to features seen in real fish. He compares the Plesioth's large pectoral fins to those seen in flying fish or freshwater butterfly fish. In those species, the fins can be stretched out when near the water's surface to sit still and balanced while waiting for prey. Muto theorizes that the Plesioth uses them for a similar purpose, additionally having its lungs function as a buoy that give it further stability in water. The ability to shoot small water projectiles from its mouth reminds Muto of the archerfish, which can also shoot small water cannons by pressing their tongue against a specialized notch in their mouth. So the Plesioth has features that allows it to sit still near the water's surface and to shoot small water projectiles. Adaptations that, to Muto, seem like clear signs that this species initially evolved to be much smaller and live off of sniping insects from the water to eat. As a possible evolutionary theory, Muto theorizes that Plesioth were originally small and lived off of insects, but that some of the larger individuals dared to attack small prey, maybe rodents, near the water's surface. Over time, selection favored individuals that were able to pull larger and larger prey underwater, like a crocodile, and so the average size of Plesioths exploded over time, with its old sniper strategy becoming redundant as it became large enough to drag a large wyvern into a watery grave. Muto, however, also alternatively proposes that maybe the small proto-Plesioths still exist, and that the individuals we see in-game are simply the largest specimens, while the more common tiny ones stick to river forests, where they don't bother anyone. Marine expert Muto continues his streak of aquatically inspired monsters by taking a look at the Cephalos and Cephadrome's head. The wide shape of it is reminiscent of that of a hammerhead shark, and would be an excellent seat for strong sensory organs. While the hammerhead lines its head with ampullae de Lorenzini, structures specialized in sensing electromagnetic waves underwater, Muto theorizes that the Cephalos instead have some kind of vibrosense that allows them to map out their surroundings by feeling vibrations in the sand through their heads. Muto proposes that such a vibrosense would be crucial to swimming in sand. Unlike water, the sands of a desert do not have uniform density, with pockets of hard, dense sand and pockets of light sand existing close to each other. With a vibrosense, a Cephalos could identify the sand density and plan its trajectory accordingly, sticking to the light sands that can actually be traversed and avoiding the dense areas that would stall its advance. Muto even suggests a possible way for this vibrosensor to develop. It is known in-game that young Cephalos start their lives in water or mud, and transition to sand once they grow. Muto's idea for their vibrosensor is that when young, the head of the Cephalos is lined with tube-like tunnels that allow water from the outside to flow in and out of it. These tunnels are lined with sensory hairs, and as the water moves around and through these tunnels, the hairs sense tiny irregularities in its motion to map out and survey the Cephalos' watery environment. But as the Piscine wyvern grows and prepares to live in the sand, the entrances of these tunnels become sealed up by a bundle of sensory follicles, and the tunnels fill with lymphatic fluid. Now, the follicles react to vibrations in the sand and transfer them through the tunnels, mimicking the functions this structure had in the Cephalos' youth without needing to let any external material enter the body. The now sealed openings of these tunnels line the head in a mesh pattern, giving the Cephalos a highly sensitive organ to survey the world with. Muto remarks that this is roughly how the lateral line organs of schooling fish function, and suggests that Cephalos would probably develop something along those lines. Next, Muto sketches out a possible social life cycle for the Cephalos, based on his extensive knowledge of marine life. He suggests that Cephalos are all born male, and that within any group, only the strongest and largest individual is granted the right to transition and become female. That would be the Cephadrome. This matriarch rules over a reverse harem, where her pheromones both attract males to her pack, while also preventing all nearby Cephalos from attempting to feminize themselves. The males pay a sort of tax to the matriarch Cephadrome in the form of sperm, which the chiefess stores in her body until the time is right. Once she has received a wide enough variety of sperm, the Cephadrome will leave its pack behind to produce the next generation. Once she leaves, all the males in her pack will compete to become the next female. The stronger and healthier a Cephalos, the faster it can complete its feminization, and once one of them succeeds in becoming the next Cephadrome, it will, again, release pheromones to forcefully detransition all the other Cephalos that weren't quite fast enough, and had only transitioned part of the way. The previous matriarch, meanwhile, lays her eggs in the shallow water of an oasis, and then abandons them immediately. Cephadrome that have laid eggs can either try to join an existing pack by defeating and chasing off their existing matriarch, form a new pack by attracting a new flock of young males, or even live their days out in solitude. Either way, Muto assumes that Cephadromes have long lifespans, whereas Cephalos that never succeed in transitioning are much shorter lived. Koji Ishigaki from the Numazu Deep Sea Aquarium joins the team with a contribution on the daimyo Hermitaur. While its namesake and general touchpoint to reality is obviously the hermit crab, Ishigaki notes that it doesn't seem able to actually fully retreat into its shell. Instead, Ishigaki believes it to be much more similar to the Oomora, a type of carrier crab. As the name suggests, these crabs have their final pair of walking legs modified into a sort of forklift with which they can grab and hold objects above their backs. Ishigaki believes that the Hermitaur's ability to hold onto Monoblos' skull functions like this too. Next, Ishigaki wonders about all the difficulties the large daimyo Hermitaur would face by living on land. Crabs require water, as they derive their oxygen from it, which is why real crabs use gills both on land and in water. A creature like the Hermitaur would have to either eat copious amounts of superhydrated foods such as fruits, or burrow into the ground regularly to lap up spring water and earth moisture. Ishigaki also does not rule out the possibility that the Hermitaur might have a water storage organ somewhere in its body. But water might not be the only challenge it faces. Ishigaki notes that the immune systems of crabs are somewhat sensitive and can easily fail when exposed to unusual environments. As an example, he describes how spider crabs can get black infection spots on their legs if they are removed from their usual habitats, which can, in extreme cases, even start rotting the skin while the crab is still alive. So perhaps the Hermitaur's biggest enemies are not monsters or hunters, but bacteria and parasites. Lastly, Ishigaki stresses that while the Hermitaur, being a crustacean, would probably be delicious, it would also be hardly worth it to kill one just for the food. As it is covered in a hard shell and is overall quite thin, there is probably not a lot of edible material on this monster, so sorry seafood fanatics. Ishigaki continues his crab contribution by briefly discussing the massive Shen Gaoren, and specifically asking, how did it get so massive? One possibility is that the Shen Gaoren originally developed in the deep sea, where predators are few and creatures that adapt to the darkness and pressure can live in relative peace. While a creature this large and slow would normally get attacked the instant it let its guard down, in the abyss, that is not a concern. So the Shen Gaoren might be the result of deep sea gigantism. Ishigaki theorizes that they first arrived on land when human fishermen began hunting their juveniles, which are probably small and just look like regular crabs. If a significant enough number of these juvenile Shen Gaoren were to escape over the years and live on land, they could feasibly have established a land-dwelling population distinct from their deep-sea cousins. Ishigaki also takes a quick look at the Gaoren's acid cannon. While he isn't quite sure if there is a direct analog to this in real life, he notes that many deep-sea isopods are known to store corrosive and harmful chemicals in their bodies, as they live near hydrothermal vents. So, perhaps the Shen Gaoren can also store up chemicals as it travels the land, maybe by visiting geysers and volcanoes. Matsuhashi returns to theorize on the evolutionary history of the Najarala. While it obviously resembles a snake, and its tactic of encircling prey with its body is somewhat reminiscent of pythons, Matsuhashi notes that it having legs and the incorporation of its tail into its attack strategy is actually more lizard-like. Snakes are believed to have evolved out of lizards, having lost many of their usual features over time. Matsuhashi thus proposes that the Najarala kept their legs as a way to aid with slithering as their bodies grew larger and heavier, and that in the process many other lizard-like features remained. Next, Matsuhashi attempts to pin down all the various snake features the Najarala displays. Its ability to administer its venom quickly and have it take effect almost immediately with a single bite seems characteristic of front-fanged snakes like cobras, which use a high-pressure venom delivery system to pump a target with venom rapidly through a strong and fast strike. However, its tactic of first trapping its victims before using its venom is more in line with rear-fanged snakes, such as the tiger keelback and many colubrids in general, whose low-pressure venom system requires them to chew on their targets to deliver their venom. In addition, the Najarala's threat display of vibrating its scales to produce a warning sound is, naturally, quite similar to rattlesnakes. So, the Najarala combines features from elapid, colubrid, and viperid snakes into one deadly package. In the next section, Kobayashi and Matsuhashi team up to tackle the Remobra of all monsters. Kobayashi begins by noting that the Remobra essentially exists as a chimera, with its head being extremely snake-like, while the rest of its body is a mix between a lizard and a bat. He continues to explain that in the pterosaurs, a real example of flying reptiles, it is believed that the head and the body evolved at different rates. According to Kobayashi, the evolution of the head tends to take priority in many species, as the ability to eat efficiently is often selected for quite harshly. So in the case of the Remobra, it's possible that it began its evolutionary journey as a snake ancestor who, instead of losing its legs, developed wings over time. Kobayashi also notes that the wings seem adapted for long-distance flights and extended airtime. Matsuhashi picks up the thread and examines how the wings might have developed. He notes that the wide membranes are a characteristic sign of glide flyers, and there are indeed reptiles today that use such membranes to glide through the air, even if full flight still eludes them. Matsuhashi specifically compares the Remobra to the flying lizards, a family of reptiles that sport a large gliding membranes. Their membranes aren't connected to their limbs, however, and so cannot be flapped for prolonged flight. Still, Matsuhashi believes a link might exist. He also notes that since Remobras are sensitive to loud sounds in-game, they might use some kind of ultrasonic echolocation to guide them through their airborne travels. Kobayashi adds to this by asserting that since Remobras are often seen in groups, their evolution must also have occurred in a communal setting. As to why Remobra would have evolved to be social, Kobayashi notes that animals generally become social for one of two reasons: to hunt together or to protect each other from being hunted. Which one applies to the Remobra can be identified by its signature ability to spit poison mist. Poison like this has the advantage of being effective even against large creatures you could usually not overpower physically, and as an aerosol, its strength increases the more it is inhaled and the higher the concentration of the mist in the air becomes. So, it seems likely that the Remobra joined into packs to hunt together, dousing their targets in clouds of poison to take down massive prey that would usually be well out of their league. Kobayashi then combines these assumptions into a possible evolutionary history for the Remobra. They were small, legged snakes that lived in an era with many powerful and large terrestrial animals. In order to compete, the small Proto-Remobra banded together into groups and became arboreal, often considered the first step in attaining flight. These Remobra colonies would lie in wait on treetops until a suitable prey walked underneath their outpost. Then, the Remobras would drop down all at once, spewing their poison as they fall, hoping that by the time they had all landed, the target would be sufficiently envenomated to succumb to the attack. This was a risky move. If the poison didn't act quickly enough, the Remobras would be stranded on the ground in front of an irritated enemy that could trample them. So, natural selection favored the evolution of glider membranes that allowed the Remobra to stay in freefall for longer and spew out more poison before hitting the ground, increasing the chances of a successful hunt. This went on and on until their membranes had become so sophisticated that the Remobra could actually, truly fly. Matsuhashi concludes this section by briefly discussing how unusual the ability to spew poison mist actually is. Tarantulas can scatter irritating hairs, and some scorpions can squirt acid, but releasing a venom in mist form is essentially unheard of. The other possible link Matsuhashi can think of is not a real animal, but the Mongolian deathworm, a cryptid that is said to inhabit the Gobi Desert and is, in some retellings, said to kill humans by exhaling poison. Munetoshi Maruyama, who works as an entomologist at the Kyushu University Museum, throws his hat into the ring with a section dedicated to the Seltas. He begins by noting that the extreme sexual dimorphism of the species, as well as the head shape of the male Seltas, seem to be analogous to the tiger beetle and the family Carabidae more broadly. The male Seltas seems to especially take cues from tiger beetles, as, just like them, it is nimble, fast, and aggressive, with a high predatory instinct. While the male Seltas is fast and can fly, the female Seltas queen is fully grounded, as she is big and heavy. Maruyama explains that this is actually quite common in insects as a whole, and theorizes that this is an adaptation to allow the Seltas queen to hold massive quantities of eggs. To do so, she must be large and able to consume and hold copious amounts of food, which doesn't work if she also has to be light enough to fly. By releasing pheromones that attract the male Seltas, the queen can surround herself with bodyguards as she hunts on the ground using her massive chelicerae. When it comes time to mate, the male Seltas runs the risk of getting eaten by the queen, and many males do in fact meet that fate once their purpose reaches its end. After all, an expecting mother needs all the nutrition she can get. Maruyama, however, notes that immediately after mating, the male Seltas seems to remain mounted on the female, which he identifies as post-mating protective behavior, where a male attempts to monopolize a female by refusing to let any rival males near her. Maruyama then moves on to Nerscylla, the original Temnoceron. He asserts that they probably grew to their current size in conjunction with their preferred prey becoming large over time as well. Spiders are covered in a soft exoskeleton that would likely not be able to support their bodies at sizes like these, which explains why the Nerscylla's hide is so tough. Her exoskeleton must have hardened as it grew to better support its weight. Next, Maruyama notes that the Nerscylla appears to be a wandering type spider, as it builds nests and retreats out of its silk, rather than full suspended webs, which is what web-type spiders do. Again, this might be explained by its size. As the weight of the body increases, it is probably simply more efficient to stick closer to the ground and build nests, rather than webs that have to fully support the weight in addition to whatever gets caught in it. One other consequence, or perhaps enabler, of the Nerscylla's large size is her head, namely that she actually has one. Spiders generally have what is called a cephalothorax, where their thorax and head segments are fused into one, which differentiates them from insects, which generally have their head and thorax as separate body segments for a total of 3 parts. The Nerscylla falls into the latter category, having a head that she can move independently from her other body segments. Maruyama remarks that this separates her pretty drastically from most spiders, but that it also makes a lot of sense. Having a cephalothorax means that in order to look in different directions, you must move your entire body. This would be extremely inefficient energetically when you are as big as an Nerscylla and have to haul potentially tons of your own body around, which is why the ability to look around by only moving the head is so advantageous in this specific case. Our resident bug expert Maruyama then takes some time to discuss various members of the Neopteron classification, starting with Vespoids. Neopterons as a whole generally resemble beetles, as was the case with the Seltas as well. Beetles are what is called subsocial, meaning that the parents care for their offspring for some time after they are born. However, Vespoids are seemingly eusocial, like ants and bees, meaning that they produce various castes and roles within their large populations that divide labor across their society, especially the labor of brooding and reproduction. In the Vespoids' case, they are known to have a queen. Maruyama remarks that this is entirely unheard of in beetles, and theorizes that it's actually a sort of mimicry of eusociality rather than the real deal. In true eusociality, the roles of queens and workers are innate and cannot be altered generally. But in Vespoids, the queen might simply be a job given to the largest female. Before becoming a queen, these females would simply have been regular Vespoids, and once a Vespoid queen is killed or otherwise disappears, the hive likely simply turns their next largest female into the next queen. This would present a case of a beetle mimicking aspects of eusociality. Next up are the Conchu, which Maruyama asserts probably originated as small parasitic insects that clung to larger animals. In modern Conchu, this ability to cling onto other creatures remains a core survival strategy, as it allows them to escape the hungry gaze of their main predator, the Yian Kut-Ku. Its ability to roll up into an armored ball thus probably developed as a secondary defense mechanism. Maruyama then moves on to Najarala, which he instantly identifies as corpse scavengers. He proposes that Najarala lay their eggs into corpses, where the larvae hatch and feed on their nest immediately. The size of the Najarala is probably linked to the availability of food. In a world of giant monsters, corpse scavengers would likely grow huge as well. This might even influence body size on an individual level. Maruyama theorizes that how much of the corpse is still edible by the time the larvae hatch determines how many times they will be able to molt before they become a pupa. After hatching, the Najarala larvae are on a timer to eat as much as they can. At certain thresholds of consumed calories, they become able to shed their skin and molt, growing larger each time. Once the proverbial timer runs out, the larvae pupate and turn into full Najarala, with the number of molts they manage to pull off beforehand determining how large they are as adults. Maruyama proposes that there would likely be pretty massive size differences between individual Najaras, based on the exact corpse they hatched in. Maruyama then concludes the section by discussing thunderbugs, whom he considers especially unique. He asserts that thunderbugs probably developed their lightning ability to produce lights in order to communicate with each other. In real bugs, light is generally produced by an interaction between the chemical luciferin and the enzyme luciferase, but the result of that reaction is light, not lightning. Based on its design, Maruyama theorizes that the thunderbug's lightning mechanism works differently, using some kind of large muscle in the thorax to produce an electric charge. The light produced in this reaction is much brighter than seen in real insects, and Maruyama wonders if this is why one kind of thunderbug, the fulgur bug, enters into symbiosis with the Zinogre, as their bright light would make them extremely easy prey otherwise. Mori returns to take a look at the Dragon of Steel himself, Kushala Daora, and specifically its metal skin. Despite its reputation, Mori theorizes that the skin must actually be pretty thin, as otherwise oxidation wouldn't corrode it quickly enough to create the Kushala's molting cycle. Its strong defensive property likely comes from an intricate layering mechanism, wherein thin sheets of the metal hide fold over each other seamlessly to create areas of high-density armor. In fact, Mori asserts that calling it armor is especially appropriate, since in order for the dragon to be able to still move, the metal hide must also be partially segmented, with different chunks of it being connected by softer, more flexible tissue, just like an actual suit of armor functions. As for how the hide is actually produced, Mori wonders if it might be the work of bacterial symbiosis. He notes that looking at the Kushala's body, with its vent tubes and dual skeletons and metal layering, it probably doesn't actually have much space for organs such as a stomach or intestine. So perhaps, it instead has a bacterial sac that can break down ores into a nutrient component and a metallic component. The former is spread into the dragon's bloodstream and provides it with energy, while the latter is sent to the skin, where it builds the metallic layers. One physical feature that catches Mori's eye here is the aforementioned dual skeleton. According to the lore, Kushala has two separate skeletons, an internal one that is fused seamlessly into its flesh to the point where it is hard to distinguish between the two, and an entirely independent exoskeleton that's merged into the metal skin. What could possibly be the purpose of such a costly, heavy adaptation? Mori believes it might not be purely for defense. Rather, it might be the key to Kushala Daora's wind control. The first clue is the fact that the Kushala can exhale cold air. This is entirely unheard of in nature, but Mori has a theory on how it works. The dragon's body might be extremely muscular, and we know that its tissue merges seamlessly with its metal parts, including the metal tube system on its chest. So, perhaps, as the muscles move and extend, pressure builds up in those tubes, and the liquid inside of them is compressed aggressively. When desired, this liquid can be funneled into a cavity adjacent to the lungs, where it rapidly decompresses, causing it to evaporate. This process cools the entire area down and chills the air inside the Kushala's lungs, allowing it to be exhaled as a cold breath. This is essentially just how a refrigerator works. Mori calls Kushala a living compressor that produces cold air through violent pressure fluctuations caused by its muscles. Its dual skeleton might then exist as a support mechanism to maintain and manage these pressures and also add onto them as the dragon moves. Mori then explains that when the liquid in the tubes is compressed initially, this would generate heat, which has to go somewhere as well. He speculates that the slender area at the bottom of the Kushala's torso might function as a heat vent. So, the Kushala is exhaling cold air from its head and venting heat from its underside. This could feasibly cause localized convection, where the hot air circulates towards the cold air to transfer energy. This process is known to cause wind, as air rushes to correct the resulting pressure gradients. Thus, according to Mori, the Kushala's wind ability originates from its expulsion of different temperatures. He does, however, admit that this does not explain how the horns play into this, or how it can manipulate the atmosphere at large. In a cute closing paragraph, Mori muses that the science of the real world simply hasn't advanced far enough for us to reconstruct logic into a creature as mystical as the Kushala Daora quite yet. Mori's final contribution to this book centers on Teostra and Lunastra, starting off with a look at their diet. The flame dragons are stated to eat ores and especially love coal, which Mori concedes could theoretically function as a source of nutrition. Natural coal is often composed of plant matter, after all. He explains that when coal burns, it produces CO2, which can theoretically be turned into carbohydrates through a process called carbon assimilation, which recombines the CO2 with water. This process is, however, usually the privilege of bacteria and plants. So, Mori theorizes that the flame dragons have symbiotic, heat-resistant bacterial colonies in their stomachs, where they burn ingested material through their body temperature and then have their bacteria perform carbon assimilation. Next, Mori moves on to the dragon's large, hairy wings. While their obvious purpose is to be used for flying, Mori points out that they might actually have originally developed for a different reason. They are where the dragon's explosive dust is produced and emitted from, so perhaps they originally served primarily as a production organ. He likens the dust to dandruff and theorizes that it is probably keratinous in nature. Mori notes that the constant production of this dust would actually hinder the dragon's ability to fly, which means that it must be a rather important ability to justify its cost. It obviously serves as a powerful defense mechanism through dust explosions, but Mori actually has another idea what it might be used for. Teostra Lunastra can spew fire, and while the lore states that they produce a flaming gas in their bodies, Mori wonders if they also use their own dust to enhance their fires. After all, if they were to groom their furry wings like cats do their fur, they would end up ingesting a lot of their explosive dust. So perhaps they store it in some kind of cheek pouch to expel it alongside their flames to give them a stronger combustion reaction. Finally, Mori discusses the question that presumably we've all been asking. How do Teostra and Lunastra mate? Stop laughing, it's actually a fairly reasonable question. Sperm and egg cells are almost entirely protein, a compound which generally cannot survive high temperatures. That is, for example, why in humans the testicles hang outside of the body. Your internal temperature is already too hot. So how would two dragons that are constantly cloaked in fire and whose body burns with magmatic heat manage to create offspring? The answer, according to Mori, can be found by looking at butterflies and moths. They, like many arthropods, utilize something called a spermatophore, which is essentially a package that the male deposits his sperm into. The package is then ejected, sometimes directly into the female and sometimes simply deposited on the ground. This can have various benefits. Sometimes the package contains a nutritious gift for the female to give her energy for the task of carrying young. In other cases, the package might have a toxic or foul-smelling surface to dissuade predators from messing with the mating process. Mori argues that Teostra might also utilize such a spermatophore, with the package being made up of heat-resistant structure molecules that would shield the sperm from the heat of the dragons. The Lunastra would then take the package into her body, where it would be delivered to her reproductive organs that would presumably be insulated from her heat, allowing the package to open safely and for fertilization to occur. Mori even wonders if this could allow the Lunastra to delay fertilization until the right moment, by storing the package for longer. Ah, nature. Matsuhashi ends his participation in this book by tackling the Chameleos. He notes that the dragon appears quite similar to certain large extant chameleon species, such as Meller's chameleon, so he wonders if the Chameleos might have evolved from them. If that were the case, it likely would have happened in a closed-off environment with few predators, such as isolated islands. Additionally, Matsuhashi even attempts to identify the exact mutation that might have caused the Chameleos to grow so large: triploidy, where a fetus possesses 3 copies of each chromosome rather than a pair of each. It's known that in some animals, this condition can cause anomalies in body size and growth, including growing rapidly and growing larger than intended. So perhaps the Chameleos species began as a series of triploid births within a regular chameleon population. Matsuhashi concedes, however, that triploid animals are generally sterile, so speciation coming from it seems unlikely. He wonders if the Chameleos we see in-game are in fact not even a species, but simply triploid individuals of a much smaller monster type that grow abnormally large. This would explain why they are so rare. Next, Matsuhashi tries to unravel the dragon's invisibility mechanism. Looking at its appearance, one might think that it would inherit the color-changing ability from chameleons, but Matsuhashi stresses that most real-world chameleons are actually not that good at changing color. Rather, most of them have a naturally fitting coloration for their environment that has evolved over time, and their skin can simply darken or lighten their natural color. The ability of the Chameleos seems much more complex by contrast, and probably works differently. Since the Chameleos exhales mist around itself and uses electrical charges in its skin to interact with it, Matsuhashi wonders if perhaps the dragon uses this to create a thin layer of water over its entire body. By manipulating this water sheet with its electrical pulses, it might be able to wear it like a reflective suit, with the water serving as a warping mirror that distorts light and makes the creature seem invisible. The book concludes with Ishigaki talking about Ceadeus. While this monster is often likened to a whale, Ishigaki notes that it has a wide maw with sharp teeth, a slender body, and swims in a wriggling motion. To this deep-sea expert, the Ceadeus seems much more likely to be a relative of the frilled shark, one of the real-world species considered a living fossil. Going from this possible link, Ishigaki begins making a few assumptions. Frilled sharks have the longest gestation period of any fish, remaining pregnant for up to 3.5 years. The resulting offspring is essentially born already in its adult state, and it is believed that this adaptation might be why they have survived in their primitive state for so long. If you never have a childhood, no predator can take advantage of its fragility. On a separate note, larger animals are often expected to have longer lifespans, and this remains true for aquatic life. Considering these two factors, Ishigaki theorizes that the Ceadeus might also be born in its already adult state, thus avoiding most predatory dangers entirely, and that this would kickstart a long life, possibly well over 100 years. But the frilled shark isn't the only touchpoint Ishigaki conjures. He mentions that in the saw shark, the unique saw protrusion developed from its teeth, and asserts that the Ceadeus' horns might also have originated as modified teeth. He also points out that the horn attack of the Ceadeus is remarkably similar to how the saw shark uses its saw, wildly swinging the head horizontally. Returning to the frilled shark, Ishigaki also wonders if the Ceadeus' beard could be a modification of the frilled shark's namesake frills, which are filamentous extensions of the gills. In the Ceadeus' case, the structure might even have been modified into being a mass of external gills as a whole. Ishigaki notes that this mass seems to also serve as a nesting ground for the symbiotic bacteria that the Ceadeus uses to create its glow. This symbiosis provides the dragon with a powerful light signal, while granting the bacteria the protection of an elder dragon's might. And that was Monster Hunter Super Biology Report Volume 2. I didn't include everything, since these guys love to go on small tangents, but I hope you learned something cool today. Remember, there is a third book like this that was made for the 15th anniversary and covers mostly world and iceborne monsters. Let me know if you'd like me to make a video on that as well. But for now, take care everyone, and I'll see you around next time. Thank you all so much for watching, and a very special thank you to all of my patrons. An extra special thank you to Jacob Coleman, Adum, Draco Vane, Hellbug Hunter, Shebo, M1Have12, Regal Eagle, Wronger97, Quali, Elzendo Carlo, Matt Hat 124, My Name Gone, The Dollarfish, King Dre, Ryan Hook, Veraxis, Thick, Kuroneko, Zion HV Augenson, AJ Rivera, Alistair, Jacob the Numbnut, Soruka, Sir Newt Newt, Evie, Rambling Robin, Hashi, Black Ace 202, Dissy, Hubbo Himbro Mirror, Magenta, Arcturian 711, Russell, Vulgar Beast, Person 212, Claire Miboon, Oakwood Tree, Mr. Pyramid, Makot02, Geo, Jamie Tate, Nils Schlatter, Iron Camel, and Nah, I'm going to bed. Take care, and I'll see you around. Bye bye.